Oh, it says Hearts of Iron in the title. Is this a Hearts of Iron 4 video? Yes.
Ha! Just kidding! It's just another history essay! Ha! Good job!
Vielleicht wird manch unter Ihnen sein, der es mir nicht verzeihen kann, dass ich die marxistischen Parteien vernichtete. Aber mein Freund, ich hab die anderen genauso vernichtet. Meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich. Hinein du gehen in das Volk. All deine Forderungen. Meine Arbeit für richtig hältst. Ob du glaubst, eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich... Ich bedauere die Opfer, die erfordern wird. Auch meinem eigenen Volk möchte ich... Dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin. Im Dienste meines Volkes. Gib du jetzt eine Stimme ab. Wenn ja... In dieser Stunde fühle ich mich verpflichtet, vor meinem Gewissen noch einmal einen Appell an die Vernunft auch in England zu richten. Ich glaube, dies tun zu können, weil ich ja nicht als besiegt um etwas bitte, sondern als Sieger nur für die Vernunft spreche. Sehe ich keinen Grund, der zur Fortführung dieses Kampfes bringen könnte. Jeden Grund uns zum zweiten Mal den Krieg erklärte. Allein ich weiß auch, dass zu Hause viele Frauen und Männer sind und Mütter sind, die trotz höchster Bereitwilligkeit auch das Letzte zu opfern. Ich weiß, dass Millionen deutsche Männer und Jünglinge bei den Gedanken glühen, sich endlich mit dem Geburt meiner Amtszeit und meines Zweifels am Ende liegt. Ich habe dann neben jedenfalls mein Gewissen erleichtert gegenüber den kommenden Dingen. Jede Stunde bereit waren, als brave deutsche Offiziere und Soldaten für Erfolg das letzte Opfer liegen und gebettet an der Seite der Gräber, in denen schon ihre Väter aus den großen Kriegen ruhen. All die anderen Kämpfer, die im Kampf der deutschen Wehrmacht eingetreten sind für die zusammen lügen mögen an den historischen Fakten, der mir von ihr erteilten Bestimmung meinem Volk die Freiheit und Ehre wiedergegeben zu haben. Die Schande, die vor 22 Jahren im Wald von Compiègne ihren Ausgang nahm, ist an dieser gleichen Stelle für immer gelöscht. Ich habe nun heute die es mir ermöglicht, denn das große Werk zu vollbringen. Sie alle haben ihr Höchstes geleistet, ihre Fähigkeit und ihren Fleiß dem deutschen Volk geweiht. Erwähnung jener Namenlosen, die nicht wenige ihre Pflicht erfüllten, die millionenfach Leib und Leben ein... Deutschland, Sieg heil!
And this is how we got to the spring of 1945. Now, the Soviets did not hesitate to massacre anything German they saw. Was it a soldier or a civilian? The Jews the Soviets had liberated. Yeah, liberated, more like raped and thrown to the streets. Well, I guess you can call that liberation. Anyways, these vengeance-thirsty Jews had given the Soviets a clear message. Exterminate them all of the Germans, no mercy. This is the kind of bullshit the Nazi propaganda radio broadcasts to the end of the war. The Volksempfänger, the Nazi propaganda radio, headed by Dr. Goebbels himself, was quite effective as every German citizen was given a free radio. Anyhow, the Soviets had already massacred millions of German civilians along their little walk to Berlin, so the slaughter was certainly not going to stop anytime soon. Hey, so that's why Prussia doesn't have any Germans anymore. It's revenge after revenge after revenge! It never ends! On 21st of April, Adolf Hitler ordered SS General Felix Stellberg... No, wait, I meant Felix Steiner. Yes, Steiner, to attack the forces of Soviet Marshal Gorky Zhukov, infamous for his, let's just say, interesting military tactics, such as German waves. And his quote:
If we commit to a mini-field, our infantry attacks exactly as it were not here. Rusby,
Gorky Khukov's forces were encircling Berlin from the north,
Sikabuya,
while Ivan Konyev's forces were encircling Berlin from the south. And so Steiner was supposed to attack Khukov with his army detachment.
Van V Van
The problem
Miskrap,
was that the detachment barely had a division worth of infantry and only a couple of operational tanks.
Xax,
So like any man with even a wee bit of sense in his head, Steiner requested to do a retreat, instead of doing a suicide attack. Now, Steiner could not get Hitler online, so he just kind of rage quitted. And then he went on to establish his Steiner Kindergarten or something, I don't know. And then, on 22nd of April, Hitler finally got informed of Steiner's early retirement, and we got that scene where Hitler is angry in that Untergang film. And so, a general named Walther Wenck became Hitler's last hope to save Berlin. Now, Wenck was also nicknamed the Boy General, as he was the youngest general in the whole of the Reich at the time. Hitler became to know and love him through his very informal report of the conditions of the Eastern Front.
As you see, my Führer, the Eastern Front is like Swiss cheese, full of holes.
Later on, Hitler ordered Wenck a bit too much work, and he ended up falling asleep at the wheel, crashing his car off the road, breaking 5 of his ribs at the process. And on the 10th of April 1945, Wenck was appointed commander of the German 12th Army, located to the west of Berlin, to guard against the advancing American and British forces. As the fronts moved closer to Berlin, the area east of the river Elbe, which was in Wenck's control, had become a vast refugee camp for German civilians fleeing from the advancing Soviet hordes. Wenck took great pains to provide food and lodging for these refugees. At one stage, it is estimated that the 12th Army was feeding 250,000 civilians every day. But then came Hitler and ordered Wenck to stop the humanitarian nonsense and staring contests with the Americans at the Western Front, and to move his arse to the east to defend Berlin. As the Americans had no reason to advance according to Hitler, as the Soviets were already throwing a party at the outskirts of Berlin. Well now, Wenck was ordered to link up with the 9th Army of General der Infanterie, Theodor Boucher. And together the French would attack the Soviets encircling Berlin from the west and from the south. And at the same time, a third guy, a general named Rudolf Holste, would take his tigers for their last meal at the north. And so, Wenck's forces started their onslaught towards Berlin, but they were halted outside of Potsdam by strong Soviet resistance. And at the same time, neither Holste or Boucher were able to do anything significant but to send their last men to the meat grinder. Boucher even managed to kill so many of his own men that the Battle of Halbe made the largest military graveyard in the whole of Germany. Things got so disorganized in there that the Waffen-SS and the Wehrmacht troops started accusing each other of ignoring each other's plight. In one documented case, an SS man appeared at the door of a cellar, intending to shoot a Panzerfaust into a cellar full of 40 civilians and young Kindersoldaten in it, only to be shot dead by one of the Wehrmacht soldiers. And by the end of the day, Berlin got encircled! Hooray! During the night of the 28th of April, Wenck reported to the Supreme Army Command that his 12th Army had been forced back along the entire front. Wenck told the Volksstadt Feuersternberg that no attack on Berlin was possible, as support from Boucher's 9th Army could no longer be expected. It's not too much of a surprise that the German Supreme Army Command, especially when there's still a certain Hitler in charge, who was in fact pumped full of drugs, everything from heroin to bull semen, in charge of the whole military, told Wenck.
Nein, 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 nein!
And to attack anyhow. Yeah, so Hitler's personal doctor was quite the fellow. Theodor Mochel was pretty much using Hitler as his experiment. I guess he was attempting to make Hitler, who was literally like an empty shell, into an actual Übermensch.
Doctor! Are you sure this will work? No!
Now, I suppose the medical experiments had the opposite effect. He developed Parkinson's. So, Wenck was not allowed to retreat, even though it pretty clearly seemed that the Soviets that had swallowed even Boucher's 9th Army whole were completely unstoppable. So Wenck could have just surrendered, just like Steiner did. But unlike Steiner, Wenck heard the cries of Berlin's trapped civilians and soldiers, and decided to plan out an offensive towards Halbe, where the men of Boucher's 9th Army were slowly grinded to death, alongside Berlin's trapped civilians. But this was not just some ordinary military offensive, no, but a rescue operation, and instead of choosing to save Hitler, Wenck chose to save Berlin's thousands of trapped inhabitants instead. He encouraged his men for a last final showdown with a court duty.
Comrades, you gotta go in once more. It's not about Berlin anymore. It's not about the Reich anymore.
The plan was not to fight for Hitler, but to save lives. Even after years of devoted service, death, murder, horror and agony, the men of the 12th Army decided to follow their general back into combat for the last final showdown. The desertion rates for the 12th Army were close to zero, something unheard of with other armies in conditions like those at the time. These men were really dedicated in fulfilling their mission to save the people of Berlin. And nothing, I repeat, nothing was going to stop them. With a fury, the 12th Army marched on Berlin, quickly puncturing a hole in Soviet lines, which opened an escape corridor for the remains of Boucher's 9th Army and thousands of Berlin's trapped civilians to pull through. Just to think what it must have felt like to see your kind pull through an escape route you are guarding with your life. One soldier remarked that he felt, quote, a feeling of loyalty, a sense of responsibility, and comradeship. Through the same exact radios Hitler had once given away for the Germans in order to be able to listen to his speeches, Wenck called to the people and soldiers of Berlin on a non-encoded radio broadcast, telling them,
Hurry up, we are waiting for you.
By not putting his message in code, Wenck ensured that civilians and all military units alike could hear the message and move to safety. Now what this also meant was that even the Soviets could hear it and work even harder to cross the corridor that had been established by the 12th Army. On boats, pontoons and on foot, a huge flood of people began pushing towards the west across the River Elbe to safety. By the time the men of the 12th Army were eventually forced to retreat, with their gun barrels completely empty of ammunition, close to 300,000 soldiers and civilians had made it to safety. As the Soviet forces began to pierce through the German lines, Wenck called upon his men again to
Hold the corridor!
to which the German forces threw themselves again in a bitter counterattack to keep the line of retreat open for just a couple more minutes. These 300,000 people, mothers, sons, daughters, both old and young, were saved from the horrendous torment that the Soviets would have caused them by the sacrifice of General Wenck and the men of the 12th Army. Each life the 12th Army gave, a dozen were saved, a true demonstration of courage and sacrifice for one's people. Wenck took the last boat across Elbe on 7th of May 1945, took his last look behind, and saw Berlin and the last dreams of a Reich dwindle away in flames. But on the other shore, he saw the end of the war, as sang in that one Sabaton song.